What is up, Rad Potential YouTube? Welcome to today's video. This is the moment you guys have all been waiting for. How are we going to make this four-rotor engine swap work in this FD RX7 and be a very tame street car? So first, we've got to decide on an engine management system. Top of the line, 2002, the Electromotive Tech 3R. So this thing can do all sorts of stuff. Drive-by-wire, Wi-Fi, you name it. It has all sorts of crazy features in it. Actually, it doesn't. The Haltech Nexus, wow, that was supposed to look way cooler when I opened the box. Nexus R3, however, does have all the features that we're going to need in order to make this four-rotor be the most streetable, drivable setup that we can have in this FD RX7. So the whole purpose of this car from the get-go is that we want this thing to have air conditioning, power steering, maintain all of the factory creature comforts of this FD RX7, even cruise control. The Nexus R3 should be able to take care of all of that. Doing a four-rotor swap in an FD RX7 and just running four rotors in general, when I got into rotaries 10 years ago, it was super rare. Following along with Rob Dom, Adam LZ, all these other guys that have four-rotor purebred race cars. The all-wheel drive car, the A90 Supra, both race cars. They require a totally different mindset when you're putting the car together than when we're going to be building this one. So, learning from them, Rob runs the Haltech Nexus R3. It seems like he can control every single thing on his car, including his all-wheel drive. He's running lights. He's using the PDM capabilities of this and pushing this ECU much further than we are actually going to use this on our street car. When you're looking at modern ECUs, we might as well have all of the safety, all of the control, and especially the resolution in all of the tables and such to be able to keep this thing a well-mannered street car. With the R3, they send you this epic Haltech bag. I'm definitely going to swipe from Johnny and I'm going to use for all sorts of cool stuff unless he wants it. This is the R3 wiring harness, the flying lead harness. Now, you can order just the plugins for the ECU here, and you can actually build your own harness for the Nexus R3, running all the inputs and outputs that you want. With our setup here, we really need just the basics of this, but this is going to simplify putting this whole car together. So unlike an Elite 2500 or most other ECUs on the market, the Nexus is a PDM. So what that means is a power distribution module. So the Nexus itself is going to power the ignition coils, the injectors. It has a built-in wideband O2 sensor controller, and we're going to take advantage of all of those things on this car. So I don't have to put some bulky fuse box somewhere in my already super cluttered engine bay, because we're going to be maintaining all of the factory RX7 wiring as far as the body control, headlights, wipers, ABS, all of that stuff is going to stay on the car. Much like if you were just doing a simple Haltech ECU swap on your sequential twins or single turbo FD, that's effectively how we're going to be integrating the four-rotor into the FD chassis. So this harness is super nice. Everything's labeled and color-coded. I'm super fired up to work with this and get this deal set up in the RX7. So let's run through all of the sensors and other infrastructure we're going to be putting on the car in order to make all of this work. Ooh, I'm confused. I just want to put it back in the bag. We don't have a ton of room in front of this engine to manage cooling. So let's just start there. I'm running a stock belt-driven REW water pump on this four-rotor. We're going to be modifying the filler neck a little bit right here. So this is a nice machined piece from Bonsai Racing that bolts on to the thermostat housing right here. From that piece, I've got this nice radiator cap. I'll be modifying this, but this is going to sit right here. The way I look at it, this is still the highest point of the entire cooling system. So the rear iron port will be blocked off. There's no coolant running through any turbos, through any intake manifolds, or any of that. Just right here is going to be our bleed point. So from here, there'll be a 90 degree on that. It's going to go down, and we're going to be coming towards the stock Koyo FD radiator. So one of the biggest things that I like to do on all of my builds is maintain part sustainability by using parts that are always going to be available. So we could modify the front end of this car, tube front it, do something crazy, get some custom radiator built for this. But then what happens when you're driving to Deals Gap and you run over a hammer, and a hammer goes through your radiator, and then you just so happen to pack a spare stock RX7 radiator, and you switch your radiator out on the side of the road, it bolts in. Well, if you had some custom radiator, you probably didn't buy 2 of them and bring the second one with you. You know, most time your street car stuff, it's not really where you're packing a whole enclosed trailer with spares. So I'm hoping that this stock FD radiator, I've modified the front crash bar just a little bit. You can see this hole right here to accommodate the OEM hose inlet on this radiator. And this is where this is going to sit. I've left enough room under it. We test fit the bumper that this is going to fit basically right behind the inlet of the bumper. It's going to look super nice up under this 99 front end, and I'm very happy to show that to you guys once we get the bumper put back on this thing after the engine bay gets painted and such. Moving to the oil coolers. We're working with Saki Bomb Garage. They just came out with a new oil cooler kit that has built-in thermostats on both oil coolers with built-in bypasses as well. So one of the things that is very important with our 4-rotor setup, be it that we have a stock oil pump in this car. So it's the same oil pump that would be in a 3-rotor that comes in a Cosmo, or that would be in your REW 2-rotor engine. So that should trigger some red flags in your head right there, because that oil pump, albeit is going to be able to make the pressure, is not quite going to flow the volume for us to push this engine at the same level that Rob Dahm, Adam LZ, Mad Mike, all these guys push their 4-rotors to. You know, we're going to probably run out of oil volume at about 6,500, maybe 7,000 RPM. However, we do need to make sure that we're keeping our oil cool, because on the street, we might be sitting in traffic. We might be firing it up on a cold morning to go to Cars and Coffee. And one thing about this 4-rotor engine is it's so big, there's so much oil in it, that those thermostat controlled oil coolers and bypasses, when you fire this thing up cold, it's going to just circulate the oil within the engine. It's going to bypass the coolers and stay in the engine. From there, once it gets warm enough, it'll kick one cooler on. And then once it gets warm enough again, it'll kick the second cooler on. And what that's going to do is really keep us at a nice, steady operating oil temperature. I know the old CYM RX7 that we had was like this. It just had straight pass oil coolers, no thermostat, and that car took forever to get warm. However, some of the coolers that just have the singular thermostat before the coolers with the bypass, you'll fire it up. As soon as the coolers kick open, it dumps all that cold oil right back into your engine. We really don't want to have that big temperature swing in the oil system. So where we're monitoring oil pressure and oil temperature is very important on the 4-rotor. So ideally, I can set it up such that I'm pulling oil temperature from the inlet of the first oil cooler. So that's going to allow us to see is the hottest oil temperature of this engine. Fresh, hot oil coming right out of the front of the engine. Oil pressure, we're going to monitor right here on the front iron. With this 4-rotor that Logan at Defined Auto Works built for us, we have these little brass tubes here that go down and feed the additional stationary gear and bearings that are in these 2 center irons. So I'll just call it like the front center iron and the rear center iron, and we'll call this one the actual center. So the front and rear center iron have a bearing in them that needs oil fed to them. Some setups rely on just the eccentric shaft to feed that oil to those bearings. The eccentric shaft, when it gets the oil from the back of the engine, oil runs up the eccentric shaft and comes out of the eccentric shaft in order to lubricate those bearings as well. We're also going to be feeding those bearings from these ports on the top of the engine. So monitoring the oil pressure in this engine, the very front up here will be the lowest oil pressure of the engine. So when we're pushing RPM, 6,500, 7,000, like I mentioned before, we might start to see the oil pressure drop at the front of the engine, which, if you learned, when my oil cooler line exploded on my RX7, which stationary gear bearing will completely wipe itself out. We lost oil pressure to the engine. What was the first failure point? The front stationary gear. So we know that that's getting oil last. So we want to really keep an eye on this and the temperature, because oil is going to be the watchful big red flag, like I mentioned. So drop in the comments below as we go through this video. The 4-rotor guys who have a lot more experience at this than I do, this is literally like touching this engine. This is the only 4-rotor in my life I've ever touched, I've ever worked on. I've got a lot of experience with RX7s and RX8s and two-rotor stuff, but drop in the comments below, guys, anything that you see as we go through this video that I can change or improve on this setup, or how you would do it differently. Because as much as y'all come to the Rad Potential YouTube channel to learn about rotary engines, there's a lot of stuff out there that I still have yet to learn. So help me make this car the most sustainable street car that we can put together. So cooling system, basically dialed. That's how we're going to run it. I'm going to hook up the stock power steering cooler in here somehow, because we are going to maintain power steering. This Ronin rack that I've modified and built engine mounts for, which you guys will see in a future video, keeps the factory power steering rack in there, and it clears the oil pan. Now that we've got oil temperature and oil pressure covered, let's look at routing these oil lines over here. So one thing that I don't have any experience with is building hard lines that would fit a -6 AN fitting right here. So I'm going to lay this out with soft, vibrant AN lines with these twist style compression fittings, and this is going to get a little tight in here with clearing the coils, which just have those resting there, so let's not knock them over. Clearing the coils, clearing my fuel lines. We're going to have a Saki Bomb Garage oil filter pedestal right here. So that pedestal is going to feed oil out of it to feed this rear center iron bearing, the front center iron bearing, and then a redundant loop of oil to the front iron up here. So I'd really not like to have 3 lines going through here. I think I can have one line that's going to do like a little loop to this one, and then bring another line off the pedestal forward and put one of those Y fittings in there, and then have a line from that that goes to here and here. So I don't think that's going to cause any issues. I've seen a lot of really trick builds with like really nice hardline piping, and I just don't have the capabilities here yet to be able to build that hardline stuff. So at least for now, we get this thing running, we start testing it, take it to the tail of the dragon at the end of the month. We can run with this. If it's a little busy and we don't like how it looks, we can change it. But I think the hardline solution is definitely going to be the best bet. I was looking at putting T's on here, but just like with the proximity of the fuel system, you know, once you get 2 of these fittings so close, you really have to be on point when you measure out and cut your rubber lines and then put those together so it's not stretching, or you don't have like you see on some LS engines where some of their crossover tubes have like a little hump in them, you know, at the front between their fuel rails. So ideally this line is nice and straight, perfectly measured, and it just fits in there and there's no weird stuff going on. I bought a Radium Engineering fuel cell with their built-in fuel surge tank for my rally car, and I was so impressed with the build quality of it. Everything, just the fit and finish, it just exceeded my expectations by far, and I was super impressed. So from there, I just was like, hey, I'm going to buy Radium stuff because it's super nice. We put their catch can on the RX7, and we're going to run their parts on the 4-rotor. So 2 primary REW regular old 2-rotor fuel rails right here. I've blocked off the center iron port, and we're just going to run 4 ID 1050 injectors. So these are Injector Dynamics 1050s down here. The feed is going to come in the back, run through both of these rails. We're going to do a little loop-de-loop, come back right here, and we're going to have a fuel pulsation dampener mounted to the coil bracket. It's probably going to sit about right there. And then the fuel pressure regulator is going to sit about right here. And the return line is going to go out between the coils, kind of next to where this oil line comes through right here. One thing I love about this setup is simplicity and just the tidiness of it. We don't have huge giant fuel rail that runs across the intake manifold. We don't have 16 injectors. We don't need it. This engine is probably going to make 400 horsepower. We're not spinning it to insane RPM, but what we do want is drivability. So that's where the fuel pulsation dampener comes in. ID 1050s aren't a bad injector to have as your primary injector that you drive around on. So a low speed injector. They're not huge. If you're driving around on ID 2000s in the primary spot, you're going to see what this pulsation dampener can do for you. What happens when you have those big injectors, every time an injector fires, it's going to drop the pressure in the fuel rails, right? Because you're releasing fuel into the engine. So that pressure drop, whenever you're firing those injectors, bang, 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 all back and forth, now you're going to start to see your pressure oscillate in the fuel rails. What the pulsation dampener does is it absorbs some of that It absorbs that oscillation in order to give you a well-mannered idle and low-speed transient throttle kind of transition with the fuel system. You won't see fuel pressure fluctuate. Now, we're running smaller injectors. Like I said, 2000s, we'd probably see or struggle to get the low speed like dialed in just because of the changes in how slow the injectors would be running. With these, I've got ID1000s in the red car. They work really well. Drivability is fantastic, and I don't have a fuel pulsation dampener. However, this piece is definitely not going to hurt having this in here, and I'm excited to be able to see what it does. In addition to the pulsation dampener, I've got the radium fuel pressure regulator. Like we talked about, simplicity, sustainability, making it easy. It needs to be reliable for the street, so less failure points. This is a fixed pressure fuel pressure regulator. So it is a 3-bar Bosch top. You don't adjust this. The top of it spins. You can point it wherever you want, but this is set to 42 PSI, and you just leave it there. I mean, honestly, I don't think I've changed my fuel pressure in the RX7 in the last year and a half, and I've got some fancy Aeromotive adjustable fuel pressure regulator. So there's no reason to have, you know, a crazy adjustable thing on something that you're pretty much going to tune once. You're not really playing with the boost that much. You know, in some cases, if you have a big horsepower car and you're running out of fuel pump, you can turn the pressure up to try to get more power out of it if you need it, but we're not really pushing that hard. In reality, we're not really pushing this engine hard at all. So their fuel pressure regulator, small, compact. I was looking at their rail-mounted one, but I was really worried it wasn't going to fit with the proximity to the housings and irons and the intake manifold on this deal. I've got 2 Haltech IGN-1A coils mocked up right here. There's many different brandings of this coil, but we were already ordering Haltech parts, so we just ordered it from the same place. So these coils will mount just like they're sitting right here. Effectively line them up so that the bottom one is the leading, the top one's the trailing. It will be impossible to mess it up. The bottom coil to the bottom plug, the top coil to the top plug, all the way down the line. But ignition system, pretty straightforward. The one thing that's tricky, and this is where, you know, the expert 4-rotor guys and even the expert 3-rotor guys and 2-rotor guys, any of y'all rotary experts in the comments, I'm going to put an OEM 2-rotor FD trigger wheel and trigger setup on the front of this. One of them is constant position and the other one is the home. So on my RX7, the red one, I ran a full function engineering 36-1 trigger wheel. So I've seen, you know, some cases where they've got some fancy billet dry sump front cover, they're running a trigger wheel like that. I think with the amount of power and stability of a crank signal that you can get out of a regular 2-rotor engine, I don't think we'll need any more resolution on the front of this than what that's going to provide. It will be very easy though to just change that over if we need more resolution. So setting up that style of Hall effect sensor, the 2 sensor one in the Haltech has already been done a bajillion times with the Elite 2500s, 1500s. It's really not that complex. But drop in the comments below if you think we'll need more resolution than that. Keep in mind, you know, we're not really pushing this thing high in the RPM range. We're not really trying to make a bajillion horsepower. We just want something that is going to sound epic and be drivable on the street. The last big engine bay part that I want to run by you guys is the O2 sensor and its location. So there's a comment on one of the previous videos like, where are your O2 sensor bungs? Are you going to monitor each rotor's O2 sensor so that you can tune the variations in fuel and consumption between them? Yes and no. With this header setup, I really don't want to clutter up this whole beautiful, sexy piece with a bunch of O2 sensor bungs or EGTs in here. Like I said, this is not a race car. We're really not pushing this thing any harder than I pushed my 12A Bridgeport with no O2 sensors. So I'm going to put an O2 sensor in rotor 3 and rotor 4, in addition to an O2 sensor after all of the rotors have collected back in the exhaust. The O2 sensors in rotor 3 and rotor 4 is going to be something we're going to use on the dyno in order to check the relative fuel consumption between rotors 3 and 4. Here's why I think that's important. Some of your 4-rotor engines are peripheral port 4-rotor engines, meaning they have an intake port right here in the housing, and they fill these ports, or if they have billet plates that don't have those ports in them. If you look at this engine right here, rotor number 1, we have primary port, ginormous front iron secondary port. Move over here, rotor number 2, primary port, small primary port. So rotor 1 and rotor 4 are going to get a bunch of extra air from this rear iron secondary port and this front iron secondary port. Hence, using rotor 3, small port, rotor 4, big and small port, to check that variation in fuel consumption. Talking with Logan at Defined Autoworks, his car, he didn't see much more than 1 to 2% difference between the two. So with the Haltech, we control each individual injector's trim. So we could actually say we want 98% of our total fuel going to rotors 2 and 3 in the middle, which would be a reduction of what the outer ones are seeing, right? So we can accommodate for that variation in airflow within the Haltech, which is super nice. So that's one of the questions I've got for you guys. We're just going to go through. I'm going to put it in the header down under the car so you won't see it. We'll move that O2 sensor back and forth. The O2 sensor that's at the collected part of the exhaust will stay on the car permanently, and that's what you'll just, once it's tuned for the street, guys, the Nexus isn't just going to magically change its tune. We can set up the closed loop parameters to give us a little bit of wiggle room, but effectively, once we get this thing tuned, it's just going to be a street car. There's no turning the boost up. There's no going to push the rev limiter any crazy higher or drag race it or really. And I don't think this thing is going to be making any cross-country drives. So having 4 more O2 sensors to burn up is probably not ideal. But do you think that that's overkill? Think we should just run it with the one O2 sensor? Let me know in the comments below. When I show you what I've got planned for the interior, you will understand why we're not going crazy with all the data and needing to monitor everything as if this was a Le Mans race car. Looking at the interior of this FD, this is one of the nicest, cleanest, beautiful 1994 RX7s that we could have started with to do the 4-rotor swap. And one thing we want to maintain inside the car is the appearance of a completely stock car. So looking at the dash in here, all the stock gauges, little touchscreen radio. It's a 94, so it has the different textured plastics. Everything is super mint. The steering wheel is super mint. You even see right here, this car had cruise control. And let me tell you, it actually worked before I took the car apart. So I'm hoping with the Nexus we can make all of this work. It's going to take some extra wiring under the dash to set these inputs and then control the outputs of a stock cruise control motor. But what you don't see in here is a full spread of Defi gauges, rainbow colors, screw holes in the dash, holes in the airbag cover, you know, a single DIN with gauges. It's just a very clean FD, and we want to maintain that. There is, however, right here on the center column cover is a boost gauge. So this boost gauge will be going away, and in its place, the Haltech CAN gauge will go right here. So this CAN gauge is going to communicate to the Nexus. We can set up all sorts of pre-programmed screens on here, and with these buttons, we can cycle between them such that we can see oil pressure, coolant temperature, oil temperature. We can monitor all of that stuff on here. Your O2 sensor, fuel pressure. We'll be able to see literally everything from this little screen. So it's not intrusive. It's not going to make you feel like you're driving some full-blown race car with an IC7 dash and little O2 sensor controllers and all sorts of stuff going on. We just want nice and clean. So I'm super stoked for this because the simplicity of being able to run one gauge is honestly a huge selling point for going to a modern CAN-based ECU, because you can see and control and pull data from just the CAN stream. You don't have to have one wire for the coolant temperature and another wire for the oil temperature and another wire for the fuel pressure and another wire for the oil pressure, and all those have to run to the ECU and gauges, and it just gets overly complex. So really trying to keep this thing full street. And that's one of the coolest things about this car, is being able to jump in here, fire it up. From the outside, it looks like a pretty tame FD. It's 99 spec, RPF ones. It's got feed fenders, which are a little aggressive, but otherwise, it's pretty much just an FD RX7, and you're going to fire it up, and it's going to sound like the 787B Le Mans car. So now that you know pretty much everything about the 4-rotor car, I've got to get back to work putting this thing together. So in addition to all the help you guys have given me in the comments, pointers about doing things this way or that way, drop in the comments below each part of this build that you guys want to see detailed videos on. Do you want to see a detailed video on the wiring? Do you want to see a detailed video on setting up the Nexus for a 4-rotor? Do you want to see a very detailed video about modifying the subframe and the steering rack and all of that stuff to be able to fit the 4-rotor in the car? Same thing with routing all the oil lines. What do you guys want to see out of this build in the next videos? Because I'm going to race a 100-acre wood rally this weekend, and when I get back, pretty much all the parts have started to trickle in for this, and we should just be crunch time, build it, paint the engine bay, put the car together. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching the video. Literally, I've been saying it in the last few videos, I cannot wait to get this thing done. We are going to be bringing this thing to Deals Gap at the end of the month, so April 12th, and definitely I'm excited to see you guys there, excited to share this build with you. It's been a long time coming, and I can't wait for this thing to fire up here in the next couple weeks. So thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Keep it rad. Red, white, and blue. It's crazy. I don't think... It's always one of the wildest things just about life in general. You know, some people probably would have never expected this Roto Red RX7 to look and rip and do what it does like it is now, based on its condition that it was in 20 years ago. You know, the FD, I don't know that any FD owner would have necessarily expected their nice 1994 white car that they bought new to have a 4-rotor in it in 1994. So who knows? Maybe there was one guy out there that just knew he could get a Mazda engine and put a 4-rotor in his car. And then honestly, the same thing about the truck. This thing's turbo, Haltech, like all restored. You know, these rotary trucks are getting hard to get. And it's real sweet seeing the transformation that all these cars have had or will have just in my tenure being a steward for them and working on them. So cool. Peace, guys.